What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. First up on the tier list is Agent Venom Iron Man Tempo. This is, in my opinion right now, the best deck in the game, and don't just take it from me. In the top 10% of Infinite, this deck has had 500 games played at the time of recording and is maintaining a near 60% win rate in those games. It was obviously phenomenal when I played it. It has become the standard ever since my videos sort of popularized it to a wider crowd, but it was of course made by Yo Woody, who cooked this deck up, and I cannot say enough good things about the way this deck works right now. It is so difficult to find a relatively fair mid-range deck that has interactive tools like Cosmo, but actually is able to go tall enough against a lot of the other things that are going to be on this tier list. Remember, this is still a metagame defined by bounce, defined by the power level that Hela puts out, and defined to a little bit of a lesser degree by Clog. So having a deck that gets to play Kitty Pryde, having a deck that gets to go tall enough to beat bounce and beat Hela is actually just a very good situation to be in. Speaking of the word situation, people have been on me about it, but I watched College Game Day and I saw Nick Saban say the word situation 7 times in 30 seconds, breaking down some tape. So I think I'm in good company when I overuse the word. Anyway, this is definitely one of the best decks in the game. If I had to pick one single deck to play, this would be the deck. It is the best deck in my estimation and by the numbers. I think it is right now perfectly positioned to be a major player, at least until the next balance changes. And I think, honestly, that it will probably survive the release of Misery at the very least. This is a powerful deck that outputs a lot of points and has good interaction. Cosmo and Kitty Pryde are great into Clog decks. You can even do things like Cosmo and then Mystique the Cosmo against a Hela deck to play multiple Cosmos and make sure their Hela can't bring stuff back. Or you can Iron Man to just go over the top. This is a metagame that is very Cosmo heavy, and this to me is the deck that does the points the best while being a Cosmo deck as well, and that is fundamentally what its relevance is predicated upon. We can't really talk about this metagame without talking about everyone's least favorite green girl, Hela. Why is it always the green cards? It is honestly just ridiculous. Hela has been this status of bad guy, bad girl, for a while now, and I think nothing has basically changed about her at all. She still has her same weakness to Clog, but there are more decks that are good into Clog right now, which makes her a bit of a sort of level 3 choice. And what I mean by that is if you assume sort of bounce is level 1, then the decks that beat bounce are level 2, and Hela ends up cleaning up against a lot of those because they're very reliant on Shadow King. However, now that we have that mid-range deck, which can actually compete with Hela on points and still have Cosmo into bounce, there is kind of a different metagame developing, and Hela is a little bit less of an automatic win against mid-range decks than she used to be. It turns out this deck can super lose when your opponent is dropping multiple 4-power Iron Men on you. That is a genuine risk. You really do need a lot of things to go your way when your opponent has lanes that are getting up to 40 power. You can actually still lose those games no matter how good your Hela is. And so this deck has had a bit of its status as the, not necessarily the top of the metagame in terms of power level, but the top of the metagame in terms of easy point output, certainly. It has had that status challenged by both Agent Venom Bounce and I think more effectively by Agent Venom mid-range. This is a powerful deck still. I don't want you to sit here and think that that's not true. Hela is good, it can win, it is a reasonable choice, and if you want to play some simple Marvel Snap, I fully recommend that you pick this deck up while you can. Note that there is some competition between Giganto and Red Hulk here. I think the real question is, how often are you going to be able to get a Red Hulk in your hand and also have the Hell Cow to discard it? Giganto and Red Hulk, I think, are very, very, very close right now. If you're missing Red Hulk, just play Giganto. Don't worry about it. Agent Venom Bounce is still very, very functional. The last time I played this exact list, it was one of my few very successful decks on the day that I played it. I think people overrate how bad this deck is because of the ways the metagame has evolved around it. I also will point out there are some flex slots in here. Bishop especially can very easily be Shadow King. That is the major flex spot. But I do consider this version of the deck a little bit easier to play, and I like putting more default versions of these lists on the tier list. In terms of the metagame, this is like an exactly at par, maybe a little bit above par deck, where it's like, I feel like this deck is just, there's a ton of skill expression. There's always going to be, you're always going to be in the game, but it's possible that other decks like the mid-range Agent Venom have a higher ceiling on the whole, thanks mostly to the card Iron Man. But also, this deck has warped the meta around itself in such a massive degree. When I think of the cards that define this metagame that we're in, yes, it's like Hela and Clog stuff, but I think the ones that are abnormally high right now are cards like Cosmo and Shadow King, and a lot of that is because of this. This is the kind of deck that people are playing Cosmo to prevent them losing to, Shadow King to win those lanes back, and because of that, you see a lot of utility that this deck would have is sort of getting cannibalized by the fact that so much of the metagame is currently specialized to beat it. I don't want people to look at this and say, oh, it's a bad deck. It's just very much the kind of thing that has a big target on its back, and I do believe that is in the process of changing. I, for example, am now trying to target the mid-range deck with Claw and Iron Man in it, and spoiler alert, the next deck we're going to show is my attempt at doing that. This is what I have been playing in order to try to beat that Agent Venom mid-range deck, and you can really see what is being attempted here, right? The basic thought process that I had was, I really want to play the card US Agent. I would like to take those 4-power Iron Men back to 0. I would like to ruin the lives of every Claw. How do I play US Agent? And I found a deck on Untapped with 25 games played in the top 10%. So if you're the person who played those 25 games, I mean, I owe you a great debt of gratitude, because I took that deck and this is that deck, and it was amazing for me into specifically a lot of people playing the first deck on this tier list. This was a deck that I went 25 and 16 with to the tune of positive 42 cubes. Great run, very well positioned right now, and my favorite of the Ajax decks in the current metagame. The reason for this, and I realize I'm saying this about a Quicksilver deck, which seems impossible, is that we have so many good 2-drops. Every other Quicksilver deck I've played, it has been, oh, wait, this sucks, right? And like, there are still some draws where this sucks, right? Oh, I'm playing Quicksilver Wiccan, that sucks. Here's the thing. I honestly felt less pressured to be a Wiccan deck in this deck than in basically any other archetype that I've tried. Like, to the point that I think maybe you could take out Quicksilver and Wiccan and run like High Evo and Abomination or something. Like, this is a deck that just works right now. When you have a final turn of Shadow King, Hazmat, and US Agent, you are going absolutely beast mode. There are some concerns related to Cosmo in those situations. I've certainly thrown games forgetting about him, but if you keep him in mind, you should be able to have a good matchup into what I would consider the best deck and still be a genuinely powerful deck that is outputting a ton of points and has a ton of tech availability in it. I was shocked at how good this deck felt into the metagame right now. It honestly just felt like everything was going the way that it was supposed to. Like, this is a deck that does what it wants to do all the time. Don't get too hung up on Wiccan, by the way. This deck really genuinely does not always have to be a Wiccan deck. Very often fine just being a deck that like plays Luke Cage and Man-Thing and Ajax, and then the 3 aforementioned 2-drops on the final turn of the game can take you home against a ton of decks. I felt like this deck was very successful for me. By far the most successful deck I have ever played with the card Quicksilver in it. Low bar, I know, but I do want to put people onto this because I don't think I'm going to have time to make a video on it specifically. The drink is still tooling around, and in 13% of its games, you know, the ones where you do the combo Storm, War Machine, Legion, this deck is actually unbeatable, and it is good that it just has a group of games that it basically can never in a million years lose. That's a very good thing to have for a deck. You'll notice also that several modifications have occurred, I believe thanks to Crazy on the EU server, where this deck is now playing Alioth and, of course, Cosmo. Again, this is in response to the metagame that has been developing. Having a Cosmo that can move around on Madam Web is incredibly important against bounce decks and Hela decks that are really going to be trying to leverage these important cards. It's also important against decks looking to counter you as a deck that has a lot of green power with Shadow King, because you can use multiple ways to make your opponent's cards not actually work. Finally, it is additionally important against Clog. Cosmo is a big reason, the utility of Cosmo is a big reason why the Clog decks are not as good as they used to be, because a lot more good decks just happen to have a Cosmo in it, and that's a problem for those archetypes. This is one of those decks that just happens to have a Cosmo in it. Like, oh, okay, you know, you're a Cannonball deck, you're trying to clog me? Well, here's a Cosmo in the lane that you were trying to clog me in. There you have a Green Goblin, and your Cannonball is about to get blown up by my Alioth. It's like very straightforward, right? And so this kind of deck is genuinely well positioned right now, just a very solid deck. I do consider it honestly very difficult to play. Like, there's a lot of like, I need to know exactly what my opponent is doing in this deck all of the time. It's very difficult. Also, I'm being told that I got my Europeans confused. It was Sizer who came up with this list, not Crazy. Apologies to Sizer, and of course, credit to him as well. I don't want to take credit for like a build of Arishem, but I do have a little bit of pride that in the top 10% of Infinite at the time of recording this video, this deck has 120 games, and I put it in my Beeg Bois video, and it is something that I cooked up live on stream. Like, I was swapping cards in and out, and it is the highest performing Arishem deck at the top 10% of Infinite right now with more than 100 game sample size. I don't know if that's going to hold up. Arishem is an inherently kind of random archetype. There is a lot of variance in there, and maybe you just need a bigger sample size for Arishem than you would need for everything else. But I still am pretty proud to see this deck near the top of the win percentage charts, because it very much is something that I personally put effort into to make this set make sense in the metagame. Now, the 4 cards that I introduced to this deck were Mobius M. Mobius, Red Guardian, Nocturne, and Sandman. Sandman, of course, aimed at bounce decks, but also at a decent amount of other decks that are like looking to do, for example, Athena deck that's really trying to play something like 5+1 on the final turn of the game, or 3+3, which happens a lot, Cosmo Mystique kind of deals in that mid-range Agent Venom deck. Sandman's pretty good there too. Like, this is a card that has wide applications across the metagame right now. We have Mobius M. Mobius, helps sometimes to make the Sandman a little bit asymmetrical, but mostly is there to deal with bounce and Sera. I think there is a decent amount less of that now. You could very easily swap him out for something else, is my personal opinion right now, but I'm not sure exactly what that thing could be. Maybe Copycat, maybe Cassandra Nova, probably Copycat. I have Nocturne in here as well, because Nocturne is just a good card against anyone playing Limbo, but also generally against Clog decks. I have found that I like having that ability in here, and rather than running Legion, who I've replaced with Sandman, I do still want some ability to control locations. Finally, Red Guardian is just amazing. Like, he's just been good all of the time, every time I've played him. He's one of the best tech cards in the game right now, I feel, and I like from turning off a Hell Cow to turning off a Black Swan to hitting an Iron Man to hitting a Claw. Like, the guy's got targets all over the metagame right now. Hit a Luke Cage, that'll work too. Like, there's just a bunch of stuff that this guy does really well right now. I've been happy with him in almost every deck I put him in. Clog is the other major archetype that I think you can expect to see. It has some problems, as we've discussed, right? Like, this is a deck that really doesn't want to see Cosmo, and there's more Cosmo than ever. It's a deck that really doesn't want to see Kitty, and now there's Kitty. It's a deck that really doesn't want to see Bounce, and there are Bounce decks still running around. It's a deck that really doesn't want to see Killmonger, and there's a decent amount of those too. What it does want to see very specifically is Hela. It wants to really, really ruin Hela. It's also pretty good into that Quicksilver deck I was playing. I think that's like probably worth noting because I don't have a Cosmo in there, right? And I don't have a Kitty in there. And so I end up just kind of eating it to Clog. What this deck does is beat up anyone who is doing things that are fair. If you are trying to play a normal game of Marvel Snap, no, sorry, you lose. You get comboed now. And there are two things that are happening at the same time that really influence my opinion of this Clog deck. The first is people are getting better at understanding what Clog actually is, which is not a curve deck, but a combo deck. It wants to do a turn 4 or turn 5 double Clog. And by the same token, people are getting better at playing against that. So there's actually like some real counterplay happening to those things. And there's a lot more thinking that I feel like I have to do when I play these matchups, both as Clog and against Clog. The most dangerous thing for this deck is getting your magic obliterated. That is just the #1 weak point here. But luckily, you'll notice, like, Nocturne is a lot more telegraphed than Legion, right? And I'm not running Legion in my Arishem deck, and not a lot of other people are running Legion, and so you are very often able to, like, really make that magic count. And boy, when you have magic, she puts the work in for sure. There are a couple of alternate builds of Clog. Here is Scream Clog, and of course, if you want to cut Hazmat and Ajax from the previous build and just run normal, like, Darkhawk type stuff, you'd be fine to do that as well. I did want to talk a little bit about Scream. Every time I've played her, I have felt disappointed. Not that she's bad, but the deck without her tends to be very, very bad and very, very low power relative to the metagame. I don't think she's a bad card. I think she's actually fine, but there is one warning I would give Scream players, and we'll talk about it a little more in the next deck where it'll actually really matter, but Scream and Kingpin are in line to receive a bit of a nerf with the card Juggernaut. They are no longer going to affect face-down cards, I suspect for consistency issues, because I think it would be very hard to explain why Scream and Kingpin affect face-down cards while Hazmat does not, for example. So I get why they would change that, but it is a notable nerf to the card, and that is worth talking about in a deck that actually plays Juggernaut, which is not this one. This one is a small Scream package being used as part of the Clog archetype, and that is, I think, fairly self-explanatory. Scream's like a pretty good scaler for this deck. It's sort of similar to the old tempo Clog lists with Thena, just using Scream and Polaris instead of those cards. Now, as you can tell from the title, I'm pretty down on Scream decks as an archetype. They are quite strong when you play the card Scream. They play a very powerful mid-range game plan, but the issue you run into is a powerful mid-range game plan in a general context is not a powerful mid-range game plan in the context of current Marvel Snap. We talked about this when we talked about the first deck on this breakdown, the Claw Iron Man AV deck. Like, that's what mid-range looks like right now. The point ceiling is drastically higher. You're out here playing 6/12s, they're playing Athena that's gonna get to 12, right? Like, you're out here playing an Arrow, they're playing a 4-power Iron Man. You find it difficult to actually go face-to-face with those decks. And that means not just that deck, but Bounce and Hela. You find those a little bit difficult too. What this deck really leverages is literally, it's just scams. Like, you have so many ways to just, like, figure out how to win something with a Magneto or an Arrow or a Cannonball, or maybe you clog them up. And, like, that's really all this deck is doing, right? Like, it's just scamming. It's good stats and good scams. And in another world, I would have really liked just, doing taxes and drinking coffee with this deck, but not in this world. It's just a little bit on the light side in terms of numbers. Speaking of the light side in terms of numbers, I think that this deck is just almost strictly worse than the first deck that we talked about here. It is almost the exact same construction, but just less numbers because you're playing Darkhawk instead of, like, good cards. And so I don't really want to devote a ton of time to this. It is perfectly acceptable. You can absolutely do this, but I think you're just going to be better off if you are able to play the deck in the first section of this video, the Agent Venom Iron Man deck. It just does things better in this metagame. We've talked a lot about point ceiling and why that matters. It matters when you talk about these two decks matching up. The only way you're going to beat a lot of decks is if they draw a lot of rocks, and they're not very likely to draw a lot of rocks, even if you perfectly combo out. Just play the deck that has more points. It matters right now. You might see decks like this running around. They arose in the immediate aftermath of bounce hitting the game kind of like a nuke. And so these are the sort of fallout from those bounce decks. And I think they're very good at beating the bounce decks, but they're not as good at handling what the metagame has become in response. And so let's talk about why. This is a deck that beats the crap out of bounce. It's just phenomenal. You even have a rogue if you want to like blow up some of the people doing the things with Iron Man, right? Rogue is very strong right now. But what this deck doesn't do is beat Cosmo basically ever. And there's so many Cosmos in the metagame right now. And that is the fundamental issue that this deck runs into. It is worse than Bounce at beating a Cosmo, and though it does beat Bounce, it's also worse than Bounce a lot of the time at beating Hela. It can beat Hela with like weird combinations of point output, but it doesn't end up really doing it with a lot of reliability. It's like a smaller version of Bounce that is teched for the mirror. That is how this is best understood. I do think that this is the kind of deck that if people weren't playing Cosmo in high amounts, would have a lot more life on it. But as is, I know this sounds ridiculous, but this is a deck from a few days ago, and right now, people are playing stuff that's a little bit stronger. Or, better matchups. If you want an intricate, high power level, high points, unexpected pick, Gnome and Jimmy Dickens have been tooling around in the top 20 with this list, and it is what I would like to describe as pure aggro, but I can't even call it pure aggro because, guess what? It's another Cosmo Madam Web deck. It's very, very difficult to play against this list. There are so many possibilities for the final turn of the game because, I don't know how many people know this, but you should get familiar real fast if you don't. If you move a Cosmo with Madam Web, priority doesn't matter, it's there. So there are just like potentially 2 lanes. You have to worry about every single lane being Cosmoed, and you have to play against that. It's horrifying. And they're doing this while putting large numbers on the board. It's just really, really scary. This deck can put out a ton of points. It can move Cosmos around, which is horrifying. It's just a very classic, I would describe this as sort of similar to the old Noki decks. That's what this feels like to me. Great points, relevant interaction for the metagame, unique and hard to play against. If you are someone who likes, having the brain chemicals do the cool thing, this might be the deck for you. I don't know who put this together, but I did want to highlight this Agent Venom deck that it's so close to being really good, but it just sort of had its lunch eaten by the Agent Venom Iron Man deck because the Agent Venom Iron Man deck just does the points a little bit better. This is a deck that I think genuinely has potential, but right now, I can't think of a good reason to play it over the AV Iron Man deck, which is sort of the problem that you have to solve, right? Like, why would I do this Bast Agent Venom deck when I could do the better Bast Agent Venom deck? Is the number one problem this deck has. That's not to say it's bad. I think it's pretty good. It's just, it is in a position where it has a big brother right now. And when you have the option to play the big brother, you typically take that option. Destroy is destroy. I genuinely have no idea what else to say about it. You know what this deck is. You know what this deck does. It's always done the same stuff that it does. It rocks. Go play destroy. It's perfectly fine. There is a flex spot in the deck that is Arnim Zola in this build, but it can be Shang-Chi, it can be Aranya, it can be a lot of stuff, right? Go play whatever you want in that spot. I am not going to get mad at you. It is perfectly acceptable and fine to do this. Feel free. It seems totally fine to me. Destroy is a deck that actually can outscale a lot of this stuff. If you get a Deadpool Hulkbuster, you are going to be able to put real big numbers on the board. Fundamentally, though, the issue this deck has is that despite its capability for big numbers, it ends up being vulnerable to a lot of different tech, and it ends up being vulnerable to its own slightly clunky draws. You can end up with amazing power on your Deadpool, but if you don't draw the X-23, you can't play Deadpool and Null on the final turn of the game. That sucks. You end up having to think a lot about priority because you really don't want to get yourself Alioth. Or, alternatively, Cosmode. Or, alternatively, you take priority and then you get Shang-Chi and Shadow King, right? Like, there's just kind of always a lot to think about with this deck. and it's a little bit fragile. And between that, those kind of things, it adds up into a deck that I'm not overwhelmingly happy playing right now, but is far from an actual bad choice. With all this conversations about point ceiling, it should be no surprise that the only Phoenix Force deck I'm even the slightest bit interested in playing is no longer the Nimrod version. The Nimrod version is only good as long as it is going to actually win games when it does the Nimrod stuff. There are probably half the decks in the game you don't beat when you do the Nimrod stuff anymore. In fact, there are some decks in this game that you don't beat when you do the Phoenix Force stuff anymore. But with Alioth, we can try to bring those decks back down to earth, create a bunch of points, play an Alioth to prevent our opponent from doing as many points as we're doing. That's kind of where this deck is at right now. It's not the best position it's ever been in, for sure. There are some issues that this deck has in terms of metagame positioning that I think I've already discussed a little bit. But generally speaking, what I'm very sure about is I don't want to be Shuri Nimrodding right now. That is not enough points to beat Hela. That is not enough points to beat Bounce. It is not enough points to beat Iron Man. It is not happening. Now we're on to the section of the video where I just talk about the decks my friends have been playing at High Infinite. This is a deck that Woody was playing before he ended up cooking up the mid-range deck that I think is the best in the game right now. This is a little bit more of a cope list, but it is a unique way to play that I've seen other people picking up and enjoying. A Scar deck that relies on Nomura. The power here is actually quite high. The issues that this deck has are pretty much that it was sort of custom made to try to beat Bounce, which is now a smaller part of the metagame, and you now have to care a lot more about people who are playing things like Cosmo and Shadow King, which this deck really does not like to see. Additionally, it doesn't like to see Clog, which is still a reasonable part of the metagame. So on the whole, I think this deck has some legs, but metagame positioning sort of forces it to be a deck at the end of this video, rather than a deck that I talk about a little bit earlier. Batman has been absolutely cooking with a separate big boy deck that is leveraging a lot more of the things this metagame is about, by which, of course, I mean, you know, Shadow King and Cosmo. I mean, how many times can I say it, right? But this deck is looking to put points on the board in confusing and unexpected ways, play a lot of just... I've never run into someone that expects the next card that this deck actually plays. Like, there's just kind of a lot going on. I personally got a lot more value out of this kind of package in the Quicksilver Wiccan version of the deck. I was much more interested in getting a US Agent in there. To me, US Agent is the drive behind why I would want to play a deck like this, and so not having US Agent or not having room for US Agent makes me much sadder about this deck as a whole, but I do think that it has a reasonable place to grow from, and I think if we could figure out a way to get US Agent in here, then I'm much more interested in this as well. Generally speaking, this deck has good interaction, good power, and unexpected point placement, which makes it a very reasonable choice. Okay, so let's talk about this. This deck was cooked up by a player named Splat, who is famous, I mean, like, I guess kind of famous, among, like, High Infinite players like myself, for just playing wild stuff. He plays weird stuff all the time. It's always something weird with this guy. And this is definitely one of those decks. A lot of people heard some streamers in sort of my circle really evangelizing this deck, and I do not have the same take on it, and unfortunately neither does the data. This deck has a 46% win rate on Untapped. That is not a good place to be. And what it is good at doing is beating up Bounce and being unexpected. Nobody is going to play around a strong guide Onslaught. Like, that is the kind of thing that people just are not used to playing against, right? But most of what this deck is doing is be unexpected, get a Sera Onslaught, get a strong guy Onslaught, do points. I realize it kind of looks like a pile, and that's because it is. The reason I included it here is to talk about how quickly the metagame has changed from Tuesday to now. And I know that sounds ridiculous. I'm recording this on like Sunday in the very early morning, right? Like, it's only been a few days. But this deck was good on like Wednesday, and now by Sunday, it's not. And that is just a demonstration of how crazy fast this metagame has been moving. That decks that were good 3 days ago end up not being relevant in the face of the new things that are happening. So, I did want to address two things. The first is, where are Surfer and Zoo? And I personally think that you can probably still play them, but they take a lot of heat from the metagame being as oriented towards points as it is, as oriented toward Cosmo as it is, and as oriented toward Shadow King as it is. I do think that those are the issues that push those decks down. I'm not saying they wouldn't normally make this list. I think you can play them right now, but I do think that you will likely have a better option available to you right now. Agent Venom pushed a lot of the decks that were close with Zoo in points above Zoo in points, right? Like, that's the fundamental issue that this deck has right now. And the same is true for Surfer. It's not a deck that can compete with 2 Iron Men. It's just very difficult for it to pull that off. And because of that, these decks that have been consistent stalwarts of the metagame have, for the first time in a very long time, not made this tier list. And I think that sucks, because those decks should always be good, and it represents something that probably should be fixed about the metagame. I do want to get to that, because I think that they should nerf Hela, they should nerf Clog, and then we should see what the metagame looks like when we're actually trying to beat these sort of Iron Man mid-range decks, which are eminently beatable. My wish list is nerf Hela somehow. I don't know how. I'm sorry. It's not my job. Nerf Clog meaningfully. Again, I don't know how. It's not my job. But once that happens, I feel like the metagame can open up again, because we won't have these constant pressures pushing us to do certain things. And even though I think they're probably not the 2 best decks in the game, I mean, I wouldn't mind a nerf to Bounce as well, because those are the decks that are setting the parameters. When you look at that Agent Venom mid-range deck, it exists and is good because of the parameters set by those decks. It is a deck that exists in context and is elite in that context, but it wouldn't be elite in every context. It's just very, very good in this one. And that is something that I think would be best addressed by changing the context, because frankly, this metagame has been very frustrating for a great amount of people. Until today and yesterday, I was just not having a ton of fun. And what really made me able to have fun was being able to play a deck that, like, cared about the board on turn 3. Like, when that's not a part of Marvel Snap, it's just very, very difficult. And so Marvel Snap being a game that is all about, like, I'm clogging you fully on turn 4, or I'm playing Hela on turn 6, or I have 70 power thanks to my Agent Venom and my bounce cards, I don't enjoy that. And I think it's a lot of why I think the power level needs to be dialed down a little bit. So that's what I wanted to talk about at the end. The second thing, of course, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Best of luck climbing. I'll see you in the next one.